Well, I want to say another word of welcome. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors here and glad to be in worship with y'all today in the third week of this series called The Other Side. If you missed the first couple of weeks of this series, I hope you'll go back and listen to them. Today will make sense, don't worry, but I hope you'll go back and listen to the other stories because I think there really is a profound progression of stories in Mark's gospel, and that's what we have been looking at. And we started a couple weeks ago in Mark chapter 4, and listen, of course we're going to have another map today, but I want to say one word about why. I want to say one word about why, or maybe three words about why. The first reason is it matters for us that we land these stories on solid ground. I think sometimes we are in danger of allowing these stories to hover above the earth. I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it again. When we see something as simple as a map, it reminds us that that is where Jesus walked. That is where he actually talked. That is where he actually went to the cross. That is where he actually rose from the dead. It reminds us that we're not just talking about ancient stories that were made up. We're talking about a record of actions, a record of ministry that actually took place, and I love it. The second reason that we use maps is because in this particular case, they add something to how we understand what God is up to. So a couple of weeks ago, in our first map, we talked about Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee, and we've got that map again. We want to see that again to remind us of where we are. We have the moving map. We moved, Jesus literally by the power of Christ moved across the Sea of Galilee. There was a storm that pushed against him, but he moved from the comfort zone of the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee, and he was headed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is where we landed last week. We've got that map up for you too. Last week we landed in Gergesa on the other side, a place called the Decapolis. This is a place that worships everything that is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is a place that is utterly hostile to the gospel, and yet Jesus lands on the other side, encounters a man who is broken in every way, and instead of holding him at arm's length, Jesus moves toward him. Jesus moves into his orbit so that this man can experience healing and wholeness in a way that he may never have experienced in his entire life. And so we left last week on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and this week we're going to be in Mark chapter 7. This story took place in Mark chapter 5, but we're going to pick up the story in Mark 7. I want you to hear what's happened since we last left off the story. At the end of Mark chapter 5, we hear about Jesus really doing two miracles in one. One, he healed a woman who was unclean, and almost at the same time, he raises a girl from the dead. It's a fascinating story. You probably need to go read that because it's good reading and you'll learn something too. At the beginning of Mark chapter 6, we see that Jesus returns to his hometown. He returns to Nazareth. Things do not go well. And so you're going to want to reread that. In Luke's gospel tells that story in an expanded version. Mark kind of summarizes the experience. He goes back to Nazareth. Things don't go well. And so he leaves. He comes back towards the Sea of Galilee. He hears that John the Baptist has been executed. Remember, Jesus is related to John the Baptist. John the Baptist has been making the way for Jesus' ministry, but he got himself killed. And so we hear that story in John chapter 6. After that, we hear the feeding of the 5,000. I want you to put a bookmark in your head because next week we're going to kind of come back to that story. But just take a note. In Mark chapter 6, we hear the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and that again is on the right side of the Sea of Galilee. And after that, we hear that Jesus is walking on water again. That brings us to the beginning of Mark chapter 7, and a fascinating story unfolds at the beginning of this chapter, and it's one that I just get a good chuckle at it. And maybe other people don't get a good chuckle at it. I don't really know, but it makes me laugh. And here's what happened. Here's what happened, and this is why it makes me laugh. At the beginning of the chapter, we hear that the religious elite, the power elite from Jerusalem, the Pharisees, these are the folks that study the law. These are the folks that study the Bible the most. They know everything. They hear about what Jesus is up to. And so they come up to Galilee to visit Jesus. And when they get there, they see that his disciples aren't washing their hands. And so they get very upset about it. They're very upset that Jesus' disciples aren't washing their hands. And the reason it makes me chuckle is it just makes me think the more things change, the more things stay the same. People are still getting mad about the not washing of the hands or other things that have nothing to do with the heart of the gospel. They have nothing to do with the center of why we are here. It turns out we didn't invent that problem. It's been happening for over 2,000 years. So there's some comfort and some frustration in that. But Jesus hears their complaining about his disciples not washing their hands. And man, he goes straight for the jugular. He starts quoting out of Isaiah. And I just want to read you Jesus' response. He says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They're talking about washing hands. There's a tradition among the Pharisees and among the Jews at this time that you should wash your hands to ritually cleanse yourself before every meal. And theoretically, this begins as an act of devotion to God, but it's become the kind of thing that we're very legalistic about, and it's become more important than even the notion of being clean before God. It matters more to these folks that your hands are clean than that your heart is clean. That's what Jesus is going straight at. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts, human teachings, instead of doctrine. You abandon, this one cuts. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. You care more about what we're used to doing. You care more about just our sacred cows than you care about how God invites us to live. That's what Jesus says. And he enters this conversation, you should go read it, about how the thing that really matters isn't what comes into us. It's not the food and the cleanliness of the food or the cleanliness of your hands that makes your heart clean. It's what comes out of you, right? Because what comes out of you doesn't come from your stomach, it comes from your heart, is what Jesus says. And so that's the backdrop, this conversation about what it means to be clean before God. That's not language that we are used to hearing in the church. We don't talk much about ritual cleanliness, but for in their context, what we're talking about is being right before God. The Pharisees are saying the way to do this is to follow the rules. Every single one of them, every time, otherwise you're toast. What Jesus is saying is the rules are not going to make you clean. It must be something deeper than that. It must be something that transforms your heart. That's the backdrop. So that's where we're going to pick up the story. If you have your Bible, I hope you'll turn to Mark chapter 7. We're going to spend the rest of the morning in the following 6 verses. We're going to start in verse 24. From there, Jesus and the disciples were with him. Jesus set out and he went away to the region of Tyre. So you know that means we've got to know where Tyre is, because as soon as we hear that Jesus is headed to Tyre, our ears need to perk up because we have a repeat event. And I'm tempted to apologize, but I'm not gonna. Here's the deal. The story that we're about to hear isn't a carbon copy of what we talked about last week, but the message is very similar. There's a reason we need to hear it again, and I'll talk to you about that in a little bit, but you're gonna start to recognize a few similarities. One of the similarities is that when Jesus says he's headed to Tyre, you can feel the disciples say, "Come on, are you serious again, Jesus?" Because Tyre is a very different place. Let's put it up on the map. Tyre isn't even in Israel. This time, Jesus isn't crossing the Sea of Galilee. He is crossing into a whole other country. He's not even in the Promised Land anymore. He's in that place. And I want to point this thing out right here. See this little, kind of jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea? That's where Tyre is. When Jesus says, or when Mark says that the disciples and Jesus are headed there, we start to get a little bit tense, and here's why. There's a long and complicated history between Israel and Tyre. And I know not all of us are passionate about history. I'm going to do my best to change that. But if you fall asleep, I'll tell you when to wake up. So here's the complicated history. It started off so good. Tyre is known throughout the Mediterranean world. They built incredible boats. They sent their boats all around the Mediterranean Sea. They founded a city called Carthage. You might have heard of them, of Hannibal fame, not Hannibal Lecter, but the other one, Hannibal of elephant fame. He comes from Carthage. It's a major, major empire in the ancient world. They started because folks left Tyre in these incredible boats. That's how powerful this community was. And in the early days of the relationship between Tyre and Israel, things were good. King Hiram of Tyre sent men and timber to King David, right? David and Goliath. He sent men and timber to David so that David could build his palace. Wasn't that a nice thing to do? And then he sent men and timber to Solomon so that Solomon could build the temple itself. So the temple, the center of the Jewish world, was built by people and lumber from Tyre. Things are so good until they're not, because eventually Tyre sends their favorite daughter to marry one of Israel's kings, and her name was Jezebel. And if you don't know the story of Jezebel, you need to go read it. I can't go into it at this point, but you need to go read her story because it's good reading. Like, it's just entertaining reading. It's also profound reading. But Jezebel is from Tyre. She marries King Ahab and leads Israel not towards God, but away from God, leads Israel into idolatry and worshiping other gods like Baal. And ultimately, that faithlessness that Jezebel leads Israel into leads to Israel's defeat and exile. So Israel is exiled in part because someone from Tyre led them away from God. That's where the animosity really starts to build. And then when Israel is sent away, there's some Jewish folks left in the area around Tyre. And so the folks from Tyre don't give them shelter. They don't help them out. They do two things. They celebrate that Israel's been defeated, and then they sell the rest of the Jewish folks in their region into slavery. I am talking about an intense hatred between Tyre and Israel. By the way, I'm saying Tyre as though that's definitely the way that you say it. I don't know. But things get so bad that throughout the Old Testament, you start to hear the prophets condemn Tyre. Right? You start to hear God pronouncing judgment over this piece of land that you're looking at right there. You hear it in the prophet Jeremiah. You hear it in Amos. I want to read you just a verse or two out of Ezekiel because I want you to get a sense of how much we hate those people. Okay, this is Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 4. They shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down its towers. This is God talking, I will scrape its soil from it and make it a bare rock. Now, here's what's fascinating, and this is bonus. Here's what's fascinating to me, and I love it. You see how Tyre kind of juts into the Mediterranean Sea? Well, originally, Tyre was really comprised of two things. It was an island about 800 yards off the coast, and there was a mainland city. Both of them comprised Tyre. Well, in about 332, so 300 years before Jesus, a man that you may have heard of, Alexander the Great, comes to Tyre and says, I want that. He just says, I want that. And so he lays siege to the mainland city and conquers it, destroys it, takes all the rubble from all the buildings in the mainland city, and builds a causeway from the mainland all the way out to the island. That's why this is just a random peninsula. It didn't naturally happen. Alexander the Great built that. It has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about today. But I just think it's very, very interesting how Alexander the Great created this context that Jesus walks into 300 years later. And also Alexander the Great ended up being a tool of God. I love that idea, that Alexander the Great is the one that God uses to accomplish the destruction that he promised on Tyre. I do feel bad for the folks that live there, but that's a different sermon. So, Jesus arrives in Tyre, and the question is, what in the world are we doing here? What in the world are we back in a place like this for? Jesus, you made us go to the Decapolis, and we didn't want to go over there. We didn't even want to get out of the boat, but you made us go over there. You made us get out of the boat, and it turned out okay, and then you took us back to the safe side of the Sea of Galilee, and we thought everything was fine, and now we're back in Tyre, and we hate this as much or more than we hate the region of the Decapolis. What in the world are you doing here, Jesus? What I want to suggest is that Jesus comes for a really particular purpose I think we have to hear. And again, some of this will sound pretty familiar to what we talked about last week. But here's how the story unfolds. I'm going to start in Mark 7, verse 20, at the end of verse 24. Jesus entered a house and didn't want anyone to know he was there. It's almost like he was hiding, but not quite. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. So here's the story. This woman is a Syrophoenician woman. She's a Canaanite woman. She's a Gentile woman. She's a Greek woman. All of that adds up to, we don't care. We don't care about her. Nobody cares about her. The setup is she has a young daughter who is in pain. If you are a mother, if you know a mother, if you've been a child, if you are a child, you know the desperation that comes when kids are in pain. The people around them who love them jump to their aid. That's what this woman is doing. Her daughter is in pain. She comes to Jesus. We don't know exactly what she's going to ask yet. But right before we find out what she asks, Mark takes this weird pause and says, hey, don't forget, she's a Syrophoenician Gentile woman. Because he wants us to remember, don't forget, we do not care about her. In the ancient world, she does not matter. And the question that immediately rises to the forefront is, if the world doesn't care about her, will Jesus? If the world does not care about this Gentile, she's not Jewish, she's not one of God's people, so she's Gentile, we don't care about her. She's not a man, she doesn't have any power. She's not rich, she doesn't have any power. She's a woman and she's poor. She doesn't have any power. Do we care about her? No. If the world doesn't care about her, will Jesus? Matthew adds on that she's a Canaanite woman, which is like insult to injury. Nobody even talked like that anymore, but Matthew's like, hey, remember, the Canaanites owned this land before the Israelites came, and we hate them too. He's piling on the reasons why Jesus should not be here, and the reasons why Jesus should not care about whatever comes out of her mouth next. But here's what happens. She begged Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. And now listen, if you were here last week or if you have ever heard of Jesus, we know what to expect. A desperate woman comes to Jesus begging for help. Of course, Jesus is going to say, you bet, I'd be happy to help you. Except for in a wild turn of events. It's exactly what Jesus doesn't do. Listen to what he says. Jesus says to her, let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. What is that, Jesus? It's the most, there are times when you run across in the Bible, there are times when you run across things that you just kind of don't understand, and it's okay, and you keep moving. And then there are times when you run across this mess, and you're like, what? How do I read whatever's next? Because what Jesus seems to have done is, in the face of this desperate mother seeking help for her kid, Jesus appears to have called her a dog. And that is not consistent at all with anything that we know about Jesus. Which brings us to at least it brings me to a full stop. Because one of two things must be true. Either Jesus is a real jerk, and we just didn't know it, but he's now revealed himself. Or there is something we don't understand about what Jesus is saying to this woman. And the rest of the testimony about Jesus throughout the Bible does not suggest Jesus is a jerk. So there must be something more than the plain surface meaning of his words. I don't know another way to take it. There must be something more. There might be something about the custom that food, before we eat food, we dedicate it to God. So that food is dedicated to God, and you don't give something that's dedicated to God to a dog. That would profane it. So maybe Jesus is talking about, hey, what I came to do is really for God's children, as in the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not for you. But that doesn't help. That still makes Jesus sound kind of like a jerk. We might understand a little bit more what he's saying, but that just doesn't help us much. It's also true that dog was a common Jewish insult lobbied at Gentiles. That might help us understand a little bit more about what Jesus is saying, but it doesn't help us, does it? I don't think we really grasp what Jesus is up to until we keep reading, as frustrating as that is. And I want you to hear, this passage is a struggle, and it's okay. This passage is hard, and it's okay. Well, we may not fully understand the depth of what Jesus is saying here, and it's okay. That doesn't mean the Bible is wrong. It doesn't mean your faith is fake. That means this is tough sledding, but it's worth working through together so that we can see, maybe we don't always understand the route that Jesus takes, but the outcome is going to sound pretty familiar. Listen to what happens next. She answered him, and I love the courage on this woman. Jesus answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." She doesn't just say, "Oh, okay, sorry, Jesus, thanks, bye." She says, "Excuse me, sir. No, the dogs do eat, because we've all been around kids and we look at the floor after they eat and most of the meal is there. So even the dogs do get to eat." And I think that's a really interesting way to respond. I want to translate it for you. This is what I think the sense of what she's saying is. She says to Jesus, if you'll just give me a morsel, just a tiny morsel, Jesus, I believe that will heal my daughter. I believe. I think that's the heart of what this woman is saying in response to Jesus' apparent rejection. She says, even the smallest morsel of what you bring to this earth, Jesus, even that is enough to heal my daughter. And the reason I think that's right is what Jesus says next. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "Woman, your faith is great. Your daughter has been healed." In Mark's gospel, he says, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And so she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon had gone. I think part of what's happening in this story is that Jesus is now living out the clean, unclean conversation from the first half of the chapter. What Jesus is saying, and I think he's challenging, the reason we get this kind of sharp-edged Jesus is not because he's trying to be a jerk to this woman. I think he's challenging his disciples' preconceived notions about who's in and who's out. Because his disciples would look at the outside, at the exterior of this woman and say, she lives in the wrong place, she's from the wrong place, she eats the wrong food, she worships the wrong God, she has no value in God's eyes. The disciples would look at the exterior and say, she is definitely out. Jesus challenges that and says, it's not the exterior that matters to God. Which, by the way, isn't the first time we've heard that in the Bible. It's not the exterior that matters most to God. It is what comes out of the heart. That profession of faith, Jesus, even the smallest morsel of what you bring to this world is enough to heal my daughter. It is the inner faith of this woman that leads ultimately to her homecoming as one of God's own children. Very similar, I think, very similar message to what we heard last week on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But I wanted you to hear it for two reasons. One, I want you to know that the story that we explored last week isn't a one-off. It's not an exception to the rule. It's not this one time Jesus crossed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and offered an olive branch to the folks who don't fit in. No, it was a pattern. Over and over and over again, Jesus reaches out to the least and the last and the lost. Last time he crossed the Sea of Galilee. This time he leaves the country in order to share this message, in order to point out to his disciples, you're still not seeing what God is up to. You're still not understanding God's heart for those who are broken, for those who are forgotten, for those who are alone, for those who can't see a way forward. You're still not hearing it. So I want you to see there's a pattern that unfolds in the gospel. The other reason that I wanted you to hear this particular story is I find it really interesting that I've just read to you the entirety of what Jesus did in Tyre. He doesn't go back to Tyre. He doesn't do anything else in Tyre. It's the first time that he's been to Tyre. He never goes back. The only thing he goes there for is this woman. That is his singular purpose in leaving the promised land, going into a hated territory, encountering a powerless and forgotten woman, and opening the doors to the kingdom of heaven. I want you to hear that. Again, because some of you are that woman. Some of you believe that you live in Tyre, Some of you believe that you are too far away. You're not on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. You're not even in the right country. And yet Jesus comes for you. There is no barrier He's unwilling to break in order to get to you. There is no distance He's unwilling to travel in order to bring you home. And you need to hear that Jesus comes to Tyre for you. And some of us need to hear this story because at some point in the future, we're going to forget. We're going to forget what God has done. We're going to forget the lengths that God has traveled. And though we may not be in Tyre right now ourselves, we'll find our way back there in the future. And you need to hear, you need to remember this story. Amnesia is so dangerous in a spiritual sense. You need to remember this story, that God is always, always coming for you. There is never a time in your life where God is not traveling to you to bring you home. It is the gospel story. Again, Jesus crosses the boundary and brings you home.